The screaming stopped at 3:47 a.m. on February 9th, 1903. What happened in those final moments inside the Harrowell estate would remain buried under Appalachian soil for more than a century, sealed away by money, mountain silence, and a family's fierce need to guard its darkest inheritance. This is not just another tale of moonshine feuds or backwoods violence. This is the story of how wealth and wilderness can forge monsters, and how an entire valley chose silence over justice for generations. The wind that night roared through the Cumberland hollows like a wounded beast, dragging the copper tang of blood across the ridgelines, carrying smoke from a chimney that should have been cold. Inside the house that locals called Harrowell, Persian rugs did not just soften the pine floors, they soaked in secrets that would sicken 5 generations. Eudora Harrowell stood at her window, staring out at the swollen moon bleeding through tattered clouds, as if the very sky had been wounded, her hands, still damp from what she had done, pressed against the frost-rimmed glass. At just 26, she ruled the household without question, matriarch of a clan that had arrived from Virginia with more wealth than some coal companies and considerably less conscience. They had not come to Appalachia for opportunity. They had fled something worse. What they carried here was not hunger, but habit, not poverty, but poison. And these mountains, so wide and so secretive, only magnified it. The Harrowell home itself mocked the neighbors' cabins and clapboard houses. A 3-story fortress of brick and oak with 23 rooms, imported furniture, and a furnace dragged up from Richmond. The family portrait in the ground foyer showed 7 faces painted in gilt, each gaze following strangers with uncanny precision. Locals whispered they had more servants than some counties had voters, yet none of those servants had been seen in weeks. Horatio Blackwell, a cousin from Virginia, managed the estate. That morning he knocked softly at Eudora's door, his voice smooth and steady. "The matter has been attended to," he said. "The others are waiting in the library." The others. The phrase made her bones hum, not from dread, but from anticipation. What no sheriff could guess, what no neighbor dared whisper, was that the Harrowell family had perfected an art form that required privacy and victims in endless supply. Appalachia provided both. The coal boom brought men and women who traveled alone, who told no one their destination, who could vanish into these ridges and never be mourned. The Harrowells had been precise, methodical. They had learned from mistakes elsewhere. But on this February night, something had gone terribly wrong. The guest who had arrived 3 days earlier, a mining engineer with survey gear and too much cash, had fought harder than expected. The basement room with its clever restraints had proven inadequate. He broke free just long enough to scream, long enough for neighbors miles away to hear the sound carried on the mountain wind. Eudora turned from the window and dressed carefully, choosing a black gown with pearl buttons. The family would need to present a united face when the county marshal arrived. They would pretend, as always, to be nothing more than eccentric aristocrats, private but harmless. But beneath the house lay the truth. A basement carved deeper than its foundations should allow. A place where screams were supposed to be silenced forever. Before we go deeper into that basement, before we follow the marshal's boots up the front steps, take a moment. Breathe. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if this story already has your skin prickling, go ahead and settle in with us. Subscribe if you haven't. Because what is coming will make every Appalachian feud you've ever read about sound like a church picnic. Outside, snow crunched under boots. Deliberate steps. Too steady to be a drifter. Too certain to be lost. Someone had been watching the Harrowell clan far longer than they had been watching their prey. Marshal Thomas Calhoun raised the raven-headed knocker and let it fall. The sound shivered through the hollow halls, echoing off marble and oak. The brass felt strangely warm in his hand, though the mountain air burned 20 degrees below freezing. It was a detail he would never forget. What he was about to discover inside that house would force the valley, and eventually the state itself, to confront truths too monstrous for any courthouse record. Secrets so dark that even now, no archive holds the full story. The Harrowells had not been born of these mountains. They had drifted into them like a storm that no one had asked for, heavy with thunder and the promise of destruction. 7 years earlier, they had left Virginia not in search of adventure, but in flight from something they never named. In the lowlands, whispers had followed them like shadows. Financial ruin, disappearances, debts paid in more than coin. The Blue Ridge could not bury such rumors, but Appalachia's deeper hollows could. Here, they found not only safety, but opportunity. The coal boom filled the valleys with strangers, surveyors, prospectors, men who wrote their names on no ledgers and sent no letters home. They came hungry, desperate, carrying their fortunes in satchels or their pockets. They came into Harrowell country like moths to a lantern flame. And moths never leave lanterns. The estate itself was a blasphemy against mountain modesty. Where neighbors lived in one-room cabins, the Harrowells raised a fortress on a bluff that overlooked the Cumberland. Brick walls 3 stories high. A parlor with chandeliers imported from Baltimore. Fireplaces wide enough to roast a cow. And a furnace, dragged by rail and mule from Richmond, that swallowed coal by the ton. Inside, the family hosted evenings with crystal glasses and heavy curtains drawn tight against the night. The locals who had glimpsed these interiors, servants, a stray preacher, the occasional merchant, spoke later of rooms too clean, too polished, as if no one truly lived in them, as if the house itself was staging a performance. Eudora presided over it all like a queen who needed no crown. Beside her, younger sister Celestine perfected a softer art, smiles that lingered, laughter that cut sharper than knives. And then there was Horatio, the manager with his ledgers and his precise Virginia vowels, who spoke of business matters while neighbors' kin went missing. The Harrowells understood isolation was not a curse, but a shield. The ridges hid them, the rivers cut them off, the mountains swallowed any question before it could echo back. Silence was a resource as rich as coal. Their method was refined. A guest would arrive, a prospector, a surveyor, a wanderer. He would be welcomed with warmth and whiskey, shown rooms finer than he'd ever seen. For 2 days, he would eat, rest, even boast of his luck. On the 3rd, he would vanish, and the Harrowells would go on as if nothing had happened, their fires burning, their curtains drawn. What made this family different from the feuding clans in the papers was not rage or drunken brawls or shotguns fired across fence lines. It was patience, calculation, a system polished like the pearl buttons on Eudora's gown. And for 7 years, it worked flawlessly. Until the February night when one guest screamed too loud, and neighbors miles away turned their heads toward Harrowell Bluff. On February 6, 1903, the Harrowells welcomed a man named Thomas McKinley, a mining engineer from Tennessee, carrying more cash than caution, with survey equipment slung in leather straps across his shoulders. He had been hired to evaluate seams of coal along the ridge, but what he found instead was an invitation too tempting to resist. Hospitality from the wealthiest family in the valley. For 2 nights, he sat at their table. Crystal glasses full, venison roasted, and conversation winding into the hours when most mountain households had long gone silent. McKinley, charmed by velvet and wine, thought himself fortunate. The Harrowells thought of him as raw material. On the 3rd night, he was guided down into the basement. The family called it the cool room, a place they claimed was for wine and provisions. In truth, it was carved too deep into the bluff, fitted with rings of iron and tables arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with storage. It was a stage where the family performed their darkest inheritance. McKinley was not the first to see it, but unlike others, he resisted. He broke free from restraints meant to hold, knocked over a table meant to terrify, and clawed his way to the staircase. His scream rose up through stone, through the hollow air, and escaped into the valley. Neighbors living 2 miles off later said it carried like the cry of a panther. Sharp, foreign, impossible to ignore. They rose from beds, stepped onto porches, listening as the mountain wind wrapped the sound around every ridge. Inside the Harrowell estate, Eudora did not panic. She simply pressed her hand to the glass, feeling the frost, steadying herself. Mistakes were rare, But mistakes had been planned for. She selected her dress carefully, the black one with pearl buttons. The family would need to look composed when the marshal arrived. That was inevitable now. They would serve smiles and tea, offer explanations rehearsed so many times the lies had become second nature. The basement, of course, had already been cleaned. Rugs turned, stains hidden, tools returned to drawers. The engineer, dragged back below, had been silenced again. But silence, once broken, has a way of echoing longer than expected. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, muting sound, covering footprints. The estate glowed with warmth that no mountain family could afford. And across the frozen ridge, steady boots approached, each step deliberate, each step closer to the truth. It was Marshal Thomas Calhoun, called in on whispers of disturbance. His lantern swung in the dark, casting light on the raven-headed knocker at the front door. When the metal met his skin, it felt warm despite the bitter cold. A detail that he would remember, though he would never quite explain it. The Harrowells were ready for him. At least, they thought they were. The Raven's Head knocker struck once, twice, 3 times. Each blow echoed through the Harrowell estate like a drumbeat announcing judgment. Inside, curtains swayed from the draft, chandeliers trembled faintly, and every set of painted eyes in the great family portrait seemed to look downward toward the door. Eudora Harrowell descended the stairs slowly, as if her steps alone could control time. Her black gown, buttoned in pearls, trailed across the marble like a shadow that had grown too heavy to lift. She paused beneath the portrait, let her hand rest briefly against the polished banister, and then opened the door with the poise of a woman greeting an honored guest at tea, not a lawman in the dead of winter. "Marshal Calhoun," she said with a warmth carefully measured, her voice smooth as cream poured over coffee. "What an unexpected pleasure. Though I must apologize, we were not expecting visitors on such a bitter morning." Thomas Calhoun removed his hat. Ice cracked from the brim and scattered like glass across the floor. His face was half hidden by his scarf, but his eyes, the eyes of a man who had walked into too many rooms like this, missed nothing. They roved across the grand foyer, cataloging what any mountain deputy might overlook. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked too evenly, as if it had been wound only moments before. The oil paintings, hunts, hounds, foxes, caught mid-stride, were too deliberate, too staged. The marble gleamed as though it had been scrubbed not for cleanliness, but for concealment. And then there were the stains. Faint, reddish-brown blotches at the base of the staircase, half hidden beneath a rug that seemed newly shifted. Stains that no scrubbing, no matter how diligent, could quite erase. Behind Eudora, the family appeared one by one, drifting into the light like figures summoned from a stage curtain. Celestine came first, her youth calculated to disarm suspicion. She was 19 but carried herself with the slow, deliberate movements of someone twice her age. Her porcelain skin, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes soft and wide. Yet beneath the softness was something sharper, something waiting. Horatio Blackwell lingered near the edge of the parlor, hands folded neatly over his pocket watch. His voice, when he finally spoke, bore the accent of old Virginia gentry, refined and practiced. "Marshal, welcome. I trust the roads were passable despite the snow?" Benedict followed, tall and deliberate, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a physician once, or so the family claimed. His absence of a medical bag this morning was noticeable. The way his fingers tapped lightly against the seams of his trousers suggested a man who wanted to appear calm, but could not quite suppress the memory of what those hands had done hours earlier. Marshal Calhoun said little. He had learned that silence made others uncomfortable. It pulled words out of them, revealed cracks in rehearsed stories. Instead, he looked at Eudora, then at the others, and finally spoke. "We're investigating the disappearance of Thomas McKinley, a mining engineer out of Tennessee. Records show he was traveling this direction before he vanished." Eudora's smile did not falter. If anything, it seemed to deepen. Ah, yes, Mr. McKinley. Such a charming guest, so full of stories. He stayed with us 2 nights before continuing toward Harlan. The weather troubled him, poor man. He wanted to be ahead of the next storm. Her words came easily, like a script repeated 100 times. The lie had been rehearsed so well that even her breath matched its rhythm. But lies, no matter how polished, eventually splinter. Marshal Calhoun let his lantern swing just slightly. Its light flickered across the marble floor, catching those faint dark streaks at the base of the staircase. They weren't random. They trailed in a line, subtle but undeniable, toward the heavy door leading down to the cellar. Not the marks of spilled drink or careless boots. Marks that suggested something had been dragged. Something that had weight. Something that resisted. When exactly did Mr. McKinley depart? Deputy Morrison asked, pulling a notepad from his coat pocket, despite the bitter cold that stiffened his fingers. The silence that followed was brief, but too brief. Benedict broke it first, his words tumbling out too quickly. Tuesday morning, before dawn, he wanted to travel before the heat of the day. Heat of the day. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. In February, in these mountains, there was no heat of day. Calhoun's jaw shifted, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. A single wrong detail often said more than 100 smooth ones. And then came the sound. Faint at first, like a whisper, so low one might mistake it for the house settling. But then clearer, rhythmic, scratching. Not random, not the frantic rustle of mice. This was deliberate, steady, almost patterned. As though someone were pressing a message through stone, hoping desperately it might reach an ear above. Deputy Chen tilted his head, rifle angled slightly. "What's that noise?" Horatio smoothed the lapel of his coat, his voice steady. "Likely rodents. Old houses draw creatures seeking warmth." But Calhoun knew better. He had heard mice scratching in barns and root cellars since boyhood. They did not move with rhythm. They did not keep time like a clock. This was something else entirely. Something human. The marshal's lantern light landed on the cellar door. Fresh gouges marred the wood, scratches half polished away, as though someone, or something, had clawed at it in desperation. Calhoun's hand slid down toward his revolver, almost unconsciously, as he straightened. His voice cut through the heavy air. "I'll need to search the premises. Standard procedure in missing persons investigations." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Eudora's smile felt brittle at its edges. Her eyes flickered, not with fear, but with calculation. She glanced toward Horatio, toward Benedict, toward Celestine, each subtle look carrying unspoken instructions. "At last," she answered, her tone velvet but firm. "Of course, Marshal. We have nothing to hide. Though I must ask your men to remain on the main floor. Some of our guest rooms contain private belongings. It would not be fitting for outsiders to view them." The words sounded gracious, even generous, but beneath them lay iron. The house was no longer just a home. It was a stage, and every member of the Harrowell family stood in their appointed place. The marshal knew it. His deputies felt it. The walls seemed to lean inward, listening. And somewhere below their boots, in the cold, dark belly of the estate, something, or someone, was still alive. The cellar door loomed at the far end of the foyer, heavy oak bound with iron. The lantern's glow found the edges of its frame, catching scratches that had been half buffed away, scars in the wood that told a story the Harrowells would never admit aloud. Marshal Calhoun stepped toward it, his boots sounding too loud on the marble floor. Each strike echoed upward into the hollow spaces of the house, through staircases, through parlors, through the silent eyes of that painted family portrait. Behind him, his deputies exchanged glances but said nothing. Men who had trailed him long enough knew when he had already made his decision. Eudora's voice drifted after him like a ribbon. "The basement is nothing more than a storage space. Coal, preserves, tools. You'll find it dreadfully dull." But her smile was too controlled, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her dress. She was not trying to dissuade him. She was buying time. Calhoun pressed the latch. The handle resisted with the stiff groan of metal left too long in dampness, though he suspected it had been oiled just recently enough to allow entrance without splintering the wood. He pushed, and the door opened on a breath of air that did not belong to any storage room. It was a draught heavy with lime and something fouler, an odor that clung to the nose and whispered of decay. The stairs fell away steeply, planks creaking under his weight as he began his descent. Each step announced itself, as if the house itself wanted every resident to know he was coming. His lantern cast shifting shadows along the stone walls, flickering light that revealed marks cut into the foundation, rings bolted at shoulder height, drainage grooves carved into the floor. These were not the hallmarks of wine storage. These were the architecture of intention. Eudora followed at a measured pace, her black gown brushing the walls, her tone deceptively casual. The previous owners dug this space for wine. We found it useful for provisions in winter. The mountains, Marshal, are not forgiving when storms close the roads. The words floated easily, but they dissolved against the sight before him. Iron shackles fixed neatly to stone. A wooden table arranged with surgical precision, tools laid out as though waiting for the next set of hands to use them. And around the edges of the room, stains that no scrubbing had managed to erase. Dark halos where liquid had pooled and been absorbed into rock. Deputy Morrison muttered under his breath, the sound not quite words. Deputy Chen tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes darting from ring to ring, tool to tool. And then, there it was again. The sound. Louder now, less muffled by layers of wood and stone. Scratching. Steady. Deliberate. Not the scatter of mice, but the cadence of will. A message forced into existence by nails against stone. Calhoun's lantern swung, seeking the source. It came from beyond a wooden partition set into the far wall, a makeshift divider that did not belong in any storage cellar. From behind it came not only scratching now, but the unmistakable rasp of labored breathing. Celestine appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her youth sharpened into something unnatural by the dim lantern light. She smiled faintly, but her hands trembled just enough to betray her. Likely a stray dog we found. It's nothing more. Her words sounded practiced, but her eyes betrayed her. She was not afraid of the Marshal. She was afraid of what he might see if he ignored her. Calhoun stepped closer to the partition, lantern held high. The light revealed a glint of metal, chains shifting ever so slightly. The breathing grew ragged, panicked by the sudden glow. Horatio's voice came from the stairs, still calm, still measured. The air down here is poor, Marshal. Not fit for long inspection. Perhaps you'd prefer to return upstairs, where we can speak comfortably. But Calhoun no longer listened. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver. His eyes had fixed on that partition, on the outline of something, no, someone, restrained within. The cellar was no longer silent. It was speaking, with scratches, with breath, with the faint rattle of chains. And in that moment, the Marshal understood the Harrowell estate was not a home at all. It was a stage built for horrors that the family had perfected in secrecy. And tonight, for the first time, the curtain had slipped. The air in the basement was heavy, sour with lime and the faint copper tang of old blood. Marshal Calhoun's lantern swayed gently, shadows flickering across iron rings in the walls, stains that clung like ghosts, and tools gleaming with surgical precision. But all of that paled before the partition at the far end, where the scratching had grown frantic, where breath rattled like a saw through wet wood. Deputy Morrison lifted his rifle. Deputy Chen took one step closer to Calhoun, his shoulders tense, his eyes flicking between the partition and the Harrowells. Every man in that chamber knew something waited on the other side of the wood, and every Harrowell knew the same. Eudora broke the silence first, her tone sweet, almost musical. Marshal, you must understand. Appearances can be deceiving. Our family has many enemies. Stories spread in valleys like smoke. I would not want you misled by... Her voice faltered, just for a moment, when the scratching turned into words. Weak, nearly broken but clear enough for all to hear. "Don't let them." The deputies froze. Calhoun stepped forward, hand gripping the partition, ready to tear it open. That was when Benedict moved. His long fingers closed around the syringe hidden in his coat pocket, a glint of glass catching lantern light. He advanced with the steady assurance of a man who had rehearsed this act 100 times in darker rooms. "Marshal," he said evenly, his voice carrying the calm of a physician. "You'll want to stand aside. This man is gravely ill. The injection will ease his suffering. It is the most civilized course." But the words did not soothe. They curdled. Deputy Chen raised his rifle, training it on Benedict. "You're not putting that into anyone." The standoff had begun. Eudora drifted toward the furnace, her hand sliding beneath it with casual grace. When it emerged, it held a weapon no doctor could explain. A shotgun modified with a shortened barrel, blackened steel built for close quarters. The faint smell of oil still clung to it. Celestine, delicate as a porcelain doll, moved to the gas valves mounted along the wall. Her slim fingers turned them with an elegance that would have suited a piano. The faint hiss of shifting pressure filled the basement. Air grew heavier. Breathing thickened. Horatio, ever composed, consulted his pocket watch as if timing the unfolding chaos. "Marshal," he said gently, "territorial law grants citizens the right to defend themselves against intrusion. I do hope you remember your statutes." His words were velvet, but his meaning was steel. Calhoun's revolver cleared its holster. The deputies tightened their grips. The lantern light jumped as if nervous itself, casting wild shadows across the stone walls. And then, without warning, the sound returned. Not the scraping from the partition. Something else. A pounding above, followed by a splintering crash that shook dust from the beams. The Harrowells turned as one, startled. From the stairwell, smoke billowed. The oak door at the top had been blown inward. Through the haze stepped a figure the family had long believed buried beneath stone. A woman limping, her left arm hanging useless, her eyes burning brighter than the lantern flame. Aurelia Moorhaven. 18 months earlier, she had been left for dead in a collapsed mine outside Fairbanks. The Harrowells had taken her gold, her partner's life, and assumed the mountain had taken hers. But the mountain had not. It had shaped her into something else. Something harder. Strapped to her chest, crude dynamite charges. In her hand, a wired trigger rigged with a dead man's switch. Every step she took into the basement made the Harrowells' poise crumble. For the first time, even Eudora's smile cracked. "You left me to die," Aurelia rasped, her voice torn raw by months of rock dust and solitude. "You thought the mountain would bury me, but it taught me patience instead." The deputies stared in disbelief. Calhoun steadied his revolver, torn between the family before him and the woman who had just torn their stage apart. Benedict's syringe trembled in his hand. Celestine froze at the valves. Horatio's pocket watch snapped shut. Eudora, ever the actress, lifted her shotgun again, her voice sharp as ice. "Child, you've brought fire into a powder keg. One twitch of your hand, and we all go to judgment together." Aurelia smiled, though the expression was closer to a scar. "That's the idea." The basement, designed to swallow secrets and silent screams, had become something else entirely. A tomb waiting to be sealed. A battlefield where every side knew one wrong move would end them all. The scratching behind the partition grew desperate, frantic, the chain rattling like thunder. McKinley was still alive, clinging to life long enough to witness justice, or die with the rest. Deputy Morrison whispered, voice thin as paper. "Marshal, what now?" But Calhoun did not answer, because there was no longer a path of law in this room. There was only survival. The trigger tightened in Aurelia's hand, a pale finger hovering over the thin wire like a hawk over a field mouse. The room held its breath. Eudora's shotgun never wavered. Celestine's fingers poised at the gas valves. Benedict's glass syringe caught a frail shard of lantern light. Horatio's pocket watch ticked once, twice, 3 times, as if keeping time for a funeral that had not yet begun. Behind the partition, the chain rattled and a voice scraped the air. "Don't let them!" The words reached the marshal like a thread thrown across a canyon. Thin, but real. He shifted his stance, revolver steady, mind racing through laws that suddenly felt like paper shields in a rainstorm. Aurelia spoke first. The sound came ragged, grim, the sound of a life sanded down to hard edges. "You turned the mountains into a market. You bought silence with bones. If I die here, I die naming you. If I live to end you." The gas hissed a little louder, the air thickening like wet wool. Deputy Chen coughed. Deputy Morrison braced his rifle and cut his eyes to Calhoun for a command that would not come. Eudora exhaled, slow and steady, then angled the shotgun a fraction, not at Aurelia, not at the deputies, but at the lantern itself. "Don't," Calhoun said, the word low and final. A footstep behind the furnace answered instead. A figure slid out of shadow with a quiet, practiced grace. Reginald, the unseen hand that solved problems the family did not want witnessed. In his grip, a bone saw polished to a mirror. He moved toward Aurelia with the calm of a man sharpening a pencil. The dead man's switch twitched. Aurelia smiled without warmth. "You always forgot to check the pulse." Reginald reached for her wrist. Time ended. The blast rose from the belly of the Harrowell estate like a mountain coughing fire. Stone buckled, beams shattered. The furnace roared once, then vanished. The lantern became a white sun and then nothing at all. A shockwave rolled through the bluff and raced the river down valley, rattling panes in houses that had already learned not to ask questions. On the ridge, neighbors saw a bloom of orange tear open the night and felt the ground thrum under their boots. 15 miles away, miners paused, lamps swaying, as a new star burned where there should have been none. By dawn, snow fell in soft ash over a crater where the basement had been. The main house leaned like a stunned animal, its spine broken. Smoke rose in thin gray ropes that twisted into the cold morning and then slipped away into the pale sky. For 3 days, men dug. The cold made their breath into ghosts and their hands into stone. On the 3rd, they found Marshal Calhoun, body pinned beneath a slab of foundation, his badge in one hand, a small leather book tucked tight to his chest. Thomas McKinley's survey notebook, pages scorched but legible. Coordinates, sketches, lists, names where there should have been none. Notes on tools laid out like prayers. Marks of iron rings at this height. Drainage cut to there. Ash traces of fabric labeled with initials. Day 3 at Harrowell. I am not alone. Federal men arrived with shovels that did not bend and questions that did not blink. The county protested and then quieted. The state sent a man who stayed one night, left with a headache, and never returned. The valley learned new words for the old story. Jurisdiction, corruption, conspiracy. The earth answered with bones. They mapped the grounds with the patience of winter. They sank stakes where the soil tasted of lime. They read the notebook against the land like scripture. At one flagged circle, they found a ring of buttons. At another, teeth. At another, nothing at all, which told them everything. When they hauled twisted metal from the crater, they found the surgeon's instruments wrapped in oilcloth, each one inscribed with careful, prideful modifications. The handiwork of a man who could recite the oath that said do no harm while thinking only of precision. Benedict had become part of the rubble. His tools had not. Eudora's shotgun lay in 2 pieces near what had been the furnace. Horatio's pocket watch turned up in a drift of soot, its face shattered, its hands stopped at 11:43. Reginald was nowhere and everywhere. Grooves on stone, a pattern of cut marks, a dozen burial sites chosen for their hunger. Celestine did not appear at all. The cave mouths along the bluff breathed only cold air and rumor. Men went in with lanterns and ropes and came out with silence. The mountains keep what they want. The notebook walked east in a federal satchel. In its wake, ledgers surfaced from hidden desks and friendly bank vaults. transfers from men whose names printed well, campaign funds that did not come with receipts, judges who learned to retire early, governors who learned that resignation is another word for gravity. The trials unspooled in rooms that smelled of paper and ink and old wood. Witnesses spoke in voices that shook and then steadied. Clerks wrote until their fingers cramped. Juries took time and then less time. The verdicts landed like stones in a river. Some sank without bubbles. Some sent ripples that touched Washington. The estate was ordered razed to its bones. The crater filled. The foundation flooded with concrete. A bronze plate set into the earth read only this: "In memory of those who died unknown." Children traced the letters and asked their parents what unknown means. The parents changed the subject and watched the trees. The valley moved on because valleys must. Winter became spring, and then winter again. Coal trains returned to their schedules. Sunday bells rang. New houses rose with straight roofs and honest porches. But some nights the wind took a certain turn and people woke with a start, sure they had heard a knock at the door that had never been theirs. Hikers came years later, then decades, finding artifacts the way waves find shells. A button stamped with a crest that did not match any local name. A surveyor's brass disc green with time. A shard of porcelain too fine for the hill. They carried them home and set them on shelves. They made conversation pieces out of warning signs. The official number settled like dust. 43. The ledger of the dead rarely balances. The men in suits said the rest lay beyond recovery. The mountains smiled without showing teeth. As for Celestine, her absence took root. Cave mouths went on breathing. Dogs would not go near them. Teenagers dared one another and came back laughing, then quiet. Once, in a thaw, someone swore they saw a figure across the bluff where the fog hangs low, a woman with hair pinned neat, watching the river. By the time the story reached town, she had spoken, and by the time it left the county, she had promised to return. People made jokes to keep from listening too closely. Aurelia became a story told softly and then louder. Some called her mad. Others called her necessary. The mountains called her by her right name and kept it. If she died in the blast, she died having turned the house inside out. If she lived out of sight. Neither answer changed what came after. Wealth had made the Harrowells fireproof for 7 years. The blast stripped the varnish. Money buys silence until the ground itself insists on testifying. In the end, it was not rage that finished them. It was evidence. Scratch marks in stone. Ink on paper. Coordinates copied twice. A notebook held so tightly a dead man could not drop it. Today the bluff looks ordinary. A stand of second-growth trees. A rectangle of grass too, even for nature. The bronze plate warms in summer and ices in winter. People jog past and do not read it. Children chase each other across the flat ground and laugh in the clean morning air. No one hears the ticking of a broken watch. Still, if you walk there alone at first light, when the fog sits low and the river mutters to itself, you might feel the earth remember. You might hear, far below, the quiet clink of a chain settling at last. You might think of a family portrait burned to ash and eyes that no longer follow anyone. Stories end. Valleys do not. The mountains keep their counsel and let us pretend we are the ones who forget. We are only scratching the surface. The next case is darker. Subscribe before it drops.